Hello, everyone, and welcome again. Good morning, and thanks for joining us. As you may or may not know, and I've mentioned a couple times, on June 2nd, next Tuesday, we are going to be hosting a very exciting virtual conference called SCJ eSummit, and it's really has some of the best speakers in the world, and they're talking about really some amazing, like, cutting edge concepts. I've sat through a number of dry runs. I've been super impressed with the information that a lot of the speakers are bringing. Well, all of them are bringing, and I'm just really excited about it. Today, I wanted to also introduce my guest who's with me, who's also one of these speakers. Purna I'm going to say Virji. Hopefully I can get it right. She was helping me. I've always tried to prep up on last names, and so I'm hoping I do them right. Purna is just, really an amazing person and a really good friend of mine. She's the senior manager of global engagement at Microsoft. She's a world-renowned speaker, literally speaks in just about every country you can imagine, and is just probably considered one of the top international experts when it comes to marketing, and literally probably one of the nicest people you're ever going to meet. Me and Purna go way back. We've spoke together at many conferences. We've explored castles together in Europe, and we both have a love and share a love for German honey wine. Especially when it happens to be snowing when you drink it, right? And so I'm really excited to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me, Purna.
Thank you for having me, Brent. I will take any opportunity to have a chat with you at any time, and of course for SCJ, I'm so thrilled to be here.
Awesome. Well, I think a lot of times these interviews or these kind of shows are just all tactical, right? We go right into the interview. And so I want to just take a little bit of a moment and kind of respect the fact that I don't think a lot of, there is a fandom in marketing, and people do want to know a little bit more about, some of the speakers or some of the experts in the world. And I don't think they always get a chance to. So I do want to take a couple moments here and just kind of ask you, how's life? How are you doing? What are you up to these days?
Life is it's good. So I'm always an eternal optimist. I will always choose to look at the best in every situation, and then I'll aggressively put blinders on because so I can tune out anything that's too negative. But of course, look, it's not an easy time for anybody, and what we've been trying to do as a family is to just find the silver linings and hold on to them. And Brent, I used to travel all the time. I'm relishing being home all the time. The time it affords me with the family has been great. I've found some new passions with veggie gardening.
So many people are doing that now, and it's fascinating. I actually have seen quite a few commercials, like on Instagram, the video commercials and stuff, talking about little plant that you can hang up in auto water, and there's a whole bunch of new technology coming out for that, and people, apparently it's like a huge trend right now.
It is, and I've gone fully down the nerdy wormhole, and I've watched all these videos. I'm making my own compost. I'm trying raised beds. I'm trying containers. I'm scientifically experimenting. So you can see how
Are you already getting the fruits from your labor? Are you already getting some edible products from this?
Absolutely. So we've been having radishes, we've had spinach, we've had lettuce. I can see my little peas coming in, and then my tomato and pepper and eggplants are still coming along. And I'm also growing okra. I love okra. And those are very beautiful plants to grow too, because they have gorgeous flower, and then you get the yummy produce, the okra at the end.
That's awesome. How much time are you spending on that? I mean, is it something that's a couple minutes each day, or do you have to actually spend quite a bit of time on it?
So my husband jokes with me. It's I do all of the planning. I'll do some of the researching, and then I'll go pick. But then I'm like, oh, honey, can you help me with the weeding? Oh, honey, can you do the digging? So then he's all gardening is not all fun, Purna, because I do.
So you're doing the fun parts. And
I'm doing all the fun parts. So it's not that much time, because I've been working really long hours, and we're all trying to adjust. I want to lean in and help, our clients at Microsoft Advertising help come through. So I've been developing a lot of training programs for them, Power Skills and all of that. So I've been keeping myself really distracted with work, or then I'll just have some outdoor time with walks. So we've been cooking a lot. It's what everybody else is doing
Yeah, for
right
sure.
now. It's like
I
there's no
spend,
difference.
I always worked from home, like my whole career for like
Hmm.
16, 17 years now. So I'm kind of used to that. But I definitely miss the travel a little bit. You know, I'm itching to like travel somewhere, for sure. But of course, that's not happening right now and probably not for the near future. And then, of course, I have, most of the time I have 5 little ones here. So I've been doing the whole homeschooling and trying to stay alive with 5 kids, right? That's been definitely interesting. But it's great to hear that you're doing well. It's great to hear that you're picking up some fun hobbies. You'll have to, I think we actually have a session at the eSummit on Tuesday that's about,
Hmm.
pot gardening, like, really kind of doing that. So that should be fun, as well as I think we have a yoga session and a couple other fun sessions that are going on outside of the main, presentations and speakers and so forth. So I want to dive a little bit into some of your topic, which essentially you're going to be speaking about, psychology, the psychology behind, ads and marketing with ads. And I think that honestly, that's personally to me one of my favorites, right? I've done, articles over the years on like, whether or not to break up paragraphs when you're writing content based on the psychology of, is it intimidating or not, and can you digest or not? And I've talked a lot about like influencer marketing, some of these different areas where really the psychology of how we approach marketing is interesting. And I guess the one spot that really changed my view on all of that was when I read the book Contagious. Which was just fascinating to see the study after study of, you expect it to do this and it actually does this, and just over and over and over and over again, you see these case studies of people acting in a different way than what they would think they would, and that's the psychology behind it. And so it's really interesting, and your topic, without getting too much into it, really touches on this. And so I wanted to ask, before we talk about some of the hard, or maybe some of the individual aspects of it, why is it that you've resonated to this side of marketing? What about the psychology of marketing kind of, fascinates you?
Brent, just like you, I'm absolutely like deeply, deeply fascinated into what moves us. Like, why do we act the way that we do? Like, whether it's we are such irrational beings and we're motivated by silly little things. It's like, why, if it's the same beef, why do we buy it if it's labeled 99% fat free versus 1% fat? Like, it's logically it's the same thing. And so I love reading psychological studies. Like, I've dived into so many of them over the past years, and I'm always learning new things. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
finding that if we can take some of these tactics, we can apply it to persuasion, to trying to get people to take action on all of our hard work that
Sure.
we put in as marketers. Now, I used to work startup my whole career before I joined Microsoft, so it was like very like two different beasts. So when you're startup world, as you know, you gotta fight for every customer. Like,
Every
every
customer.
dollar is
Yep.
so valuable and it's so big. And so a part of that sparked my interest. I had an amazing boss who would really like open my eyes to this in the past. So like, hey Dave, thank you. So it was so great that to get to go and like read about this and be like, why was one of the most powerful headlines? Like, they laughed until he sat on the piano, until he played. I'm completely butchering it, but
Yeah.
why do some of these things work? And so that for me has been uh, um, very fascinating. But what more drove me was I was noticing, regardless of when a study was done, there were some things that stayed the same. And
Mm-hmm.
I realized that everything that's old is new again, but it's always been the same. There are some constant truths that don't change no matter what technology comes in the way, no matter how modern or advanced a society is. Some things about us don't change, which is why I put together all of this research that I'll cover at SEJ eSummit.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it was fascinating for me. There's another book that I read that I really highly recommend for people. It's called Stumbling on Happiness, and it talks about how the brain works and how memories work and how we function, mentally, and how we interpret what we interpret. And so it was between those two books, it was really fascinating. But I always find it interesting, like my number one thing I always kind of go back to was this concept of the 70s commercial about pollution, where they had the Native American man who was walking next to the highway, and a car comes past and they throw some trash out, and there's some trash on the ground, and then a tear drops down the Indians, the Native Americans' face. And in the book Contagious, they explain that like this was one of the most impactful commercials of all time for the wrong reasons, because it basically told people it's okay to litter. People don't follow ideology, they follow patterns, and they follow what everyone else is doing. And so the fact that somebody was able to throw trash out of a car, and the fact that there was other trash on the highway, meant that it's acceptable. And so people actually take it away. And so it always kind of reminds me of like the smoking commercials, where they'd be like, oh, your lungs look like this or something. And I was like, really, you want to get people to stop smoking? Just show one person light up a cigarette and everybody at the party stop talking and just stare at them awkwardly until they put the cigarette out, and then the party starts again. And that's what would actually make more sense. So I find those aspects. What do you think has been, from your search, like if you think about one specific example of psychology and marketing, or an angle of it that has really been effective or you saw working, what would be kind of one area of discovery that you've learned over the years?
Firstly, I love that example. I haven't seen that commercial, but I'm going to check it out. And you're absolutely right why it didn't work. So there's so many, but something that comes to mind, and I'll talk about this because there was so much good stuff I didn't get a chance to fit it into my deck.
Oh,
so
yeah,
I'll
you were
give
saying
this
that.
to you now.
Absolutely, yeah, sure.
It's the whole aspect of curiosity. Like, as humans, we've always been very curious beings, and we're always motivated to find out more. It's one of the reasons why, and one of my favorite stories actually is, think about 100 years ago, puffed rice, puffed wheat, like those puffed grains were invented in the market. The products did actually really terribly until the ad agency came in and started talking about, oh, food shot from guns, grains popped to like 8x their size, come and have a look. And that got people very curious, and it motivated them. And so I've seen that same principle, and something that resonated to me has been the Avis ad from the 60s. I don't know if you remember this, like Avis Rent-A-Car. They were not number one at the time. Like they were like a struggling, like a second or third tier brand at their time in the market. They came out with an ad that says, we're not number one. Why would you go with us? That was the whole headline, an entire print ad. And then the rest of the copy talked about how, like, hey, we pay more attention to the little details, like your ashtray is always going to be clean, your gas tank's going to be full, your seats are going to be like more comfy, or all of this. So they went into all of these details, saying that we're not the number one, so we have to try harder, so you need to choose us. And I don't know, for me, I think that resonated really well, because I felt like always working at Microsoft Advertising, we are the underdog in the market. And something that clients tell us is that our sales teams and our account reps are very like partners, and they are, we're trying harder as well, because you have to when you're not number one.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because there's a concept that I first learned from Jason Silva, who was actually an individual. I watched We Are Gods Now, and it's a video series that he had done. And it got me started on my whole passion for futurism, right? It was just this concept that we've evolved to such a point that we're essentially like gods now. Like we act as if we're gods in a way. And religion aside, wording aside, the concept is very interesting, and it got me started. But one of the things that that kind of phrase that he went was mindgasms, this idea that we learn something that is so fundamental and so groundbreaking that it requires us to go through everything we know and readjust all of that information. And it happens in this kind of like mind-blown feeling. And he calls them, mindgasms and stuff. And it's interesting as well, because when you talk about curiosity, one of the things that the Contagious book talked about was this, and I can't remember the source, whether it was New York Times but it was a major publication, and they had gone and looked at what was shared the most. And of all the content that was shared, the most shared content is science, because it just is curiosity. It's like something unique and something interesting. So every time we talk about a particle discovered, every time we talk about teleportation, every time we talk about space, these things get the most shares of any type of content. And so that always fascinated me because you wouldn't expect that, you know, but it's interesting.
It really is. And then if you can take that science and then layer it on with advertising, or just even pulling from science into advertising, I feel like there's such a huge crossroad. Can I tell you about another study?
Absolutely, please do.
So this was done several years ago. Essentially, it took first responders like police, EMTs, the firemen and women, and got them into a room, and they had them all watch the same film of a car crash. Then they broke up that big group and they asked them a slight variation of the same question, which was, how fast do you think the car was going when it smashed into the other car? How fast do you think it was going when it collided with the other car?
Yeah.
How fast do you think it was going when it made contact?
I know this study, by the way. It's great.
It's so fascinating to me. And so then it's a net, the study proved that just even the choice of word had a big difference on perception.
Well, the thing about that study is that they actually didn't crash, right?
There was another one. So it was like a week after the study was done. They asked all of the participants, do you remember seeing broken glass at the scene? And there actually wasn't any broken glass, but 1/3 of all the people who had the word smash were like, oh yeah, we remember seeing broken glass.
I think they have the same study, actually. I believe it's the exact same study, had another one where they had a stop sign. And they were like, which way did they turn when they got to the stop sign? Did they keep driving after they got to the stop sign? And everybody was like, oh, they turned right. They all answered this and everything, and there was no stop sign, right? It was just like the wording projected it. And that's what's really interesting about that book. If you haven't read it, definitely Stumbling on Happiness, because it talks about how we actually don't remember. We remember one key point and then the end. And then we fill in all the other gaps. And once we actually tie some sort of emotion, we talk about it, we visualize it one time, then we replace the actual memory with the projected memory. So anytime they would have people with color swabs and they'd ask them, how did you feel about that color? And then when they'd come in and ask them to pick the same color, they couldn't. But if they came in and showed them the exact variation of a color and they chose it and they didn't say a single word to them and ask them later to choose it, they could. So it was like, once they actually put memory and emotion and wrote over that information with a memory, that memory took over. And that's how, like, they say that every person that sees that, they see their own thing. No matter what, they always see their own thing. And it's not wrong or right. It's their interpretation of that memory that they wrote for themselves. And so all of our memories are kind of like filled in, which makes it fascinating. And that's how a lot of subliminal marketing has always been effective, is that, it basically ties in to these kind of subtle aspects of being able to place memories for us, to place emotions, to place feelings. And that's why if you notice, I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but
this is fascinating.
Coca-Cola does an amazing job, and I've always given them credit for, they pick advertisements that are based on life events. So Pepsi and Coke will sponsor like an event like the World Cup, right? Because when you're at the World Cup, it's a life memory. And you're always going to remember that Coca-Cola. I remember, I had this awesome Coke, and you remember those life moments more impactfully. So they do things like virtual reality. They do a lot of like first technology, so that you can say to yourself, when you first ever did, virtual reality, what was it? Oh, it was Coca-Cola had this big campaign, right? So they're really big about being present at moments. And that was, I don't know, a lot of people might not know this, but Red Bull's success to their marketing was to go and give away free Red Bulls at lunchtime at gas stations, because everybody was in that tired phase about 1 o'clock after lunch. They would come, and only for a short period of time, they would hand out Red Bulls to people so that they would start getting used to the fact that Red Bull brought them back for the day, right? It gave them wings or whatever, right? So those are such interesting aspects. But I do want to ask you a question. And you can go into as many examples as you want. I don't mind at all. I love this conversation as well. But it's curious because there's all this data and there's all this information. And we talk about the psychology of marketing, filtered in through a lot of different tactical type of conversations. But yet, today, when you really look at marketing, there's still so many companies, so many people who don't really incorporate psychological principles, right? Which we know are fundamental. Literally, you can think one way and do something completely different. Your purchase can be 100% different based on psychological principles, but yet so many companies still don't really utilize it in their marketing plans, right? They go with, oh, well, I think this would happen. They don't include triggers, or they don't, a lot of these elements. So I'm curious your opinion. Why do you think we're still in a place where a lot of digital marketing campaigns, traditional did a lot more psychological principles, but the digital marketing campaigns never really picked it up as much? I'm curious your thoughts on why that is. Why do so many companies kind of not really engage in that?
That's such a good question. I'm really glad you asked that. Like, so I have like a personal theory on it. So my personal theory on it is, one, we have so much access to data that we're just like, oh, we don't need to look anywhere else. Just the data will tell us everything that we want. And then remember, data is just numbers, like the insights that we take away from it. We're not fully informing ourselves, and we're just taking, it's still our best guess when we're taking, no matter how scientific it is, it's still quite
For sure.
wild. So that's one, it's the data. And the two is that we refuse. It's like, I don't think many people haven't seen the value in going back in time and researching and learning from the past. It was so tough back then to think about, like, you just had you had a direct mail letter, you had one magazine, you couldn't get all of this data, you couldn't understand. So you really had to work 10x harder to try to understand the human and be able to resonate. And then all you would go back and look at is your sales to see whether, because we didn't have click-through rate, we didn't have like return on ad spend, we didn't have, I'm not sure, we had some variation, but it wasn't there. And very often we think like, oh, why on earth should we go back and look at what direct mail did? Like, what can my like short 140 character tweet, how can it be benefited by like an entire long direct mail piece? But the fact is, there's so many of those psychological principles that still apply. Oh, I think one of my favorite examples, I think I read this on Conversion Rate Experts blog a while ago, where they talked about how a commercial that Apple was running a few years ago was based on a really, really old principle from a beer brewing company whose name escapes me now. So a while ago, there was this, I think it's Anheuser-Busch, but don't quote me on this one. Sure. There was a beer company. They were not doing that well in the market, and they were still struggling. They were again number 2, number 3. And they called in, their ad person was like, let me take a tour of your factory and your facility, and maybe that will help me. So he did. And then he created a whole magazine ad that talked about how the entire brewing process, it described it, it made it sound very special. But here's the thing, like every other beer company followed the same process. Brewing is the brewing, exactly. But the fact that he described it and put it all together and be like the purest waters, and then it goes here, and then the hops are gently dropped in, or whatever he described it as, made it seem special. And then Apple did something really, really similar. I forget with one of their like computing devices, like not one of their tablets or iPods. It was way back when, but they talked about their computer and this computing power and how it did all of this. Every other computer also does that, but it convinced advertisers that it was something special. So you see, if you go back in time, you do learn different tactics, you'll learn different ideas, you'll learn about different principles. So I love it. Like, I'll go and study old TV commercials. I'll go back and I'll read direct mail. I'll still study, because you can apply that to email and beyond. TV advertising, you'll learn so much. Like, to your smoking ad, it's true, like we all show people smoking, and then we'll be like, this is the damage to your lungs. But people ignore that. You tend to just put your blinders on and be like, it's fun, and do that. There was something super interesting, an agency called Alma. I saw this at a Cannes Lions show I did in LATAM last year, where this agency called Alma of Miami, they came up with a new concept where they would be like, they had somebody just talking about the reason why they quit. So they talked about the love for the family. Like, I wanted my child, like my father smoked, my grandfather smoked. I was very young when my father died of a heart attack. I don't want my son to go through what I went through. And that, it was just one person telling their story. And at that point, I'm like, well, I don't smoke, but would not even want the urge to
Yeah,
pick it
yeah,
up.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's all about personalizing it, right? It's like, and that's where a lot of the, demographic research and stuff like that. I think you made a good point earlier in that, in your response to why kind of people don't get involved. And I think a lot of times it's easy to look at somebody else's efforts and say that was really impressive, right? Who used to do this? Marty Weintraub, right?
Yeah.
He does this. They'll be like, oh, well, we just decided we would target people with this psychographics and this. And I would be like, wow, I never would have thought of that. It makes such logical sense when you hear it, but I don't know that starting point. Maybe that's part of the reason why people kind of don't really understand the psychological side, because where's the book? Where's the guide that takes you back to the psychological principles? Which, if you're listening, there is definitely research to be done. You can go search psychological principles. There's a whole category of baselines that are from the psychology, like psychologists and stuff. They will actually look for certain patterns to segment people when they're doing therapy. And those same segments can be used for segmenting people when you're doing marketing. And it tells you, how were they brought up? Your generational factors have huge aspects. Where were they raised, in the North or in the South, or overseas, or, in the US? Or there's so many different aspects that once you start looking at psychological principles can really guide your marketing plans. And I think that, as you mentioned, your presentation, next Tuesday really dives into kind of like these specific things and these principles and how they can help you kind of determine what works, what will work. And so I'm really excited to kind of listen to that and hear more about it. Is that generally the overview of kind of what you're discussing next Tuesday?
Exactly. So I'm going to talk about 4 principles that have survived since the time of cavemen, which is what I'm talking about. I'm like, listen, things that cavemen cared about, maybe like clubs, dinosaurs, dragging women by the head. That's changed. But what hasn't changed is what motivates us to take action. Like they would draw on the wall to promote something or to attract a mate or get attention, to, all of our motivations for why we do things or why we were designed. It's unchanged, and it's lasted through every recession, every downturn, every positive phase in human history. It's like, what's something that has proven to stand the test of time? There's lots of them, but I'm going to focus in my 20 minutes on 4 of them and show examples of what can be done.
Beautiful. I can't wait to see it. I mean, I do, like I said at the beginning, I think that this is one of those areas, kind of like analytics, right? Where it's like people are like, oh, I love to know data, but I'm not really going to do anything with it. I think this is one of those areas that every person that goes down this path truly gets fascinated by it. And then you start to see, wow, this really works, right? This really has an impact. And so I'm really excited to see that presentation. I appreciate you taking the time to join us on Tuesday and give that presentation. We're going to go ahead and we're kind of run out of time. So I do want to end on one note. I'd love it if you can just tell anybody who's watching or who's going to watch this later, where can people find you online? Where can they go and follow your work and learn more about you, or maybe even potentially contact you?
Awesome. Well, I'm obsessively on Twitter all the time, and I'm also on LinkedIn very, very often. So either of those two, I'm at Purna Virji at Twitter and Purna Virji on LinkedIn. So definitely stop by, say hello. And if you have any cool scientific studies on advertising, send them my way. Like, I live for this stuff.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Purna, thank you so much for joining me. And again, everybody, please make sure you register for the event. Come see Purna's session. It's going to be well worth your time, and we look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you all. I hope I see you next week.
Cheers.